Besides, the Confederacy did not recognize Abraham Lincoln as their president, and therefore insisted that the document had no effect on them at all. In reality, however, the Emancipation Proclamation was one of the most radical documents in American history. From that point forward, the war would be fought to free the slaves, rather than simply to maintain the Union. The proclamation affected the outcome of the war in two significant ways. First, it affected international diplomacy with the South. The Confederacy had always assumed that British dependence on Southern cotton would entice them to recognize the Confederate States as a legitimate nation, an idea called cotton diplomacy. The South could then trade their cotton to Britain in exchange for guns and other manufactured goods. This plan was already proving difficult because England and France were uneasy about breaking the Union blockade of southern ports. Both of these countries had also already ended slavery within their own empires. England in 1838 and France in 1848, and had been working hard to suppress the international slave trade. By making the war a fight to abolish human bondage, Lincoln effectively blocked any chance that Britain and France would become a Confederate ally. The second and more significant result of the Emancipation Proclamation is that it allowed Union forces to begin using African American men as soldiers. All across the South, slaves left plantations in the thousands and fled to Union Army lines. Nearly 180,000 black men would serve in the Union Army before the war ended. That's nearly 10% of Union Army forces. Initially, they were used to perform menial labor, digging latrines, cooking meals, caring for livestock, in order to free white men for fighting. They were paid less, and they were not allowed to serve as officers. But by the summer of 1863, black men were being sent into battle, where they proved themselves to be excellent fighters. After all, they were fighting for the freedom of their fathers and mothers, their wives and children, and for themselves. Together, we have examined the beginning and the middle of the Civil War, so we must now turn our attention to the end. Despite the fact that right and justice and morality were on the side of the Union during the conflict, a Northern victory was not guaranteed. During the first couple of years in particular, the South benefited from momentum and morale. They insisted that one good rebel could lick a dozen Yankee boys in a go. They had the potential to dig in and fight a defensive war against an invading enemy unfamiliar with the geography. They had a cavalry that could ride circles around the enemy, and some of the best military leaders ever trained by West Point, the Citadel, or the Virginia Military Institute. They had Robert E. Lee. By contrast, the North had George McClellan, an officer who could train an army better than any other man, but was afraid to use it. 1863 changed all of that. The Emancipation Proclamation and the use of African American troops began to undermine Southern morale. Lee's loss at Gettysburg and the surrender of the Mississippi River, both in July of 1863, signaled the beginning of the end for the Confederate Army. The last 2 years of the war were about the efficient use of manpower and materiel, both of which the Union had in spades. If we look at the South in 1860, we see that of the 12 million people who lived there, 1/3 were enslaved. Another third were free women, leaving only 4 million men to draw from. We can assume that about half of those were children and another portion too old to fight. That leaves, at most, about 1.5 million men who were of age to enlist, and not all of those did. Yet the North had 3 times the number of free men, and about 2 million served in the Union Army. When Ulysses Grant took control of the Army of the Potomac, he came to realize that this long conflict would be a war of attrition. Whoever had the most men standing at the end would be the winner. The North had the most men. The Confederate government tried to increase the size of their army. They used recruitment propaganda. They even tried a draft. But still they could not attract more men to fight. In fact, during the war, as many as 100,000 men deserted the Confederate Army. To be fair, the North had their share of desertions as well, but proportionally not as many as the Southern Army. The lilting girl left behind ballad Lorena was even banned in camp because it tended to incite men to desert. The need for manpower grew so desperate in the Southern ranks that the Confederate Congress passed a law that allowed male slaves to take up arms and fight with the rebel forces. That law passed in March 1865, less than a month before Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox. The larger portion of the northern states meant that they not only had more men to stand and fight, but also more men to stay and work in the factories and on the farms. Northern presses were able to crank out over 700,000 copies of George Root's song, The Battle Cry of Freedom, while Southern newspapers were printed on the back of surplus newspaper stock, wallpaper stock. And this disparity was true for staples and war goods as well. For every bushel of Southern wheat grown, there were 4 bushels from the North. Even though Southern states grew 96% of the country's cotton, for every yard of cloth that they could produce, the North could produce 13. For every gun the South made, the North made 32. To add insult to injury, the Union controlled 96% of the military naval ships. So thanks to the blockade, the South couldn't import these things from foreign countries. And even that assumes that they had the merchant ships to do so. For every Southern merchant ship, there were 9 from the North. The Confederate States of America was created, in essence, to protect the institution of slavery. The South lost everything it was fighting for and more. In 1865, the Confederacy was forced to decide which was more important, nationhood or slavery. Vice President Alexander Stephens had called slavery the cornerstone of the new nation. But by voting to allow black men to fight, they decided that being an independent nation was more important. Yet even that nation was doomed. After Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse in April 1865 and the capture of Jefferson Davis a month later, both the Confederate Army and government were destroyed. The institution of slavery was officially wiped out in the United States with the ratification of the 13th Amendment later that year. The Union fought to preserve the nation. They got everything they fought for and more. Despite a tremendous loss of life, nearly 400,000 on the Union side alone, they had won the war, brought the nation back together, and destroyed the peculiar institution of slavery. As Julia Ward Howe wrote in the Battle Hymn of the Republic, I can read his righteous sentence by the dim and flaring lamps. In this case, that sentence condemned the Confederacy and held up the Union as the victor.